The scent of desperation had a particular smell in Abilene, Kansas, and on this scorching July afternoon in 1878, it mixed with the dust and manure that coated every surface of the cattle town's back alleys. Eliza Thornton crouched behind the butcher's shop, her once fine traveling dress now tattered and stained, as she tore apart the last crust of bread she had begged from the baker's wife that morning. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but the emaciated mongrel before her needed it more. The dog's ribs showed through its matted fur, and its brown eyes held the same hollow desperation she saw in her own reflection whenever she passed a storefront window. "Here, boy," she whispered, extending another small piece. "I know it is not much, but it is all we have." The dog crept forward, its tail giving a hesitant wag as it gently took the offering from her fingers. Eliza smiled despite everything. 3 weeks ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Philadelphia, traveling west to marry a ranch foreman she had courted through letters for 8 months. But when she arrived in Abilene, she discovered that Bernard Hayes had gambled away his position, his money, and apparently his conscience before disappearing into the territories. The boarding house proprietor had given her 2 days before throwing her belongings into the street, and Eliza had been too ashamed to wire her family for money to return home. Her father had warned her about Western men and their promises. She could not bear to prove him right. "You are feeding that mangy creature your own food." Eliza startled, nearly dropping the remaining bread as she looked up. A man stood at the alley's entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright street beyond. As he stepped forward, she saw he was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking hazel that seemed to assess everything in a single glance. "The dog was hungrier than I am," Eliza said, lifting her chin even as she remained crouched in the dirt. She would not be shamed for showing kindness, even in her reduced circumstances. The cowboy studied her for a long moment, taking in her thin frame, the dark circles under her blue eyes, and the way her chestnut hair had escaped its pins to hang in tangles around her face. Then he looked at the dog, which had pressed itself against the wall ready to bolt. "Come inside," he said, gesturing toward the street. "I'll feed you both proper." Eliza stood slowly, her legs stiff from crouching. "I do not accept charity from strangers, sir. Name's James Kincaid." "Now we are not strangers." He tilted his head slightly. "And it is not charity. I need help at my ranch, and you look like you could use work. We can discuss terms over a meal, unless you would rather stay in this alley." Pride warred with hunger in Eliza's chest, but the dog whined softly, and she realized she was not just deciding for herself anymore. "Very well, Mr. Kincaid, but I insist on repaying any meal with labor." "Fair enough." James turned and began walking, clearly expecting her to follow. After a moment's hesitation, Eliza did, and the dog trailed behind them both, keeping a wary distance. The restaurant James led them to was modest but clean, a small establishment that catered to working men rather than the rowdy saloons that lined Texas Street. The owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Chen, who had come west with the railroad workers, raised an eyebrow when she saw the dog but said nothing when James nodded at her. "3 steaks, potatoes, beans, and bread," James said, "and a bowl of water." "3?" Mrs. Chen asked, "one for the dog." Eliza felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She could not remember the last time someone had shown her such casual kindness. "Thank you," she managed. They sat at a corner table, the dog lying beneath it with its head on its paws, still uncertain but too tired and hungry to run. James removed his hat, revealing the full extent of his sun-streaked hair, and leaned back in his chair. "So what brings a Philadelphia lady to Abilene?" he asked. Eliza's eyes widened. "How did your accent, and that dress was expensive once, tailored in an Eastern style." He shrugged. "I am not as ignorant as I look." I never suggested you were ignorant, Eliza said quickly, then sighed. I came west to marry a man who turned out to be less than advertised. Bernard Hayes, you knew of him. He worked at the Circle T for about 3 months before old man Thompson caught him cheating at cards with the other hands. That was back in April. James's expression was sympathetic. I am sorry, that must have been a hard discovery. It was my own foolishness, Eliza said bitterly. My father warned me, but I thought I knew better. I wanted adventure, independence. I wanted to prove I could make my own choices. Nothing foolish about wanting those things, James said. You just picked the wrong man to want them with, Mrs. Chen arrived with their food, and Eliza had to restrain herself from falling on it like a wild animal. She forced herself to eat slowly to maintain some dignity, but each bite was heaven. The steak was tough but flavorful, the potatoes swimming in butter, the beans seasoned with bacon. When James set the third plate on the floor, the dog looked at him with something close to worship before devouring its meal. Tell me about this work you mentioned, Eliza said between bites. James cut a piece of steak, chewed thoughtfully. I have a small ranch about 5 miles north of town. 200 acres, decent water, good grass. I have been running cattle, but I also breed horses. The problem is that I have been doing everything myself since my parents died 2 years ago. My mother used to manage the house, keep the books, handle the garden and chickens. I have been trying to do it all, and I am drowning. He met her eyes directly. I need someone who can cook, clean, help with the accounts. I can offer room, board, and $30 a month. $30 a month was more than fair for such work, which immediately made Eliza suspicious. Why me? Why not hire someone from town? Because everyone in town knows everyone, and hiring a single woman to live on my ranch would cause talk. You are new, you need work, and frankly, you look desperate enough to actually do the job instead of spending all day gossiping. He smiled slightly. Plus, you were feeding a stray dog your own food. That says something about character. Eliza considered this. He was right that she was desperate, but there was also the question of propriety. People will talk regardless, Mr. Kincaid, a single woman living with a single man. Then we will tell people you are my cousin from back east, James said. Or we can get a chaperone if it makes you more comfortable. Old Widow Parker lives on the neighboring ranch. She could stay over a few nights a week. The offer was generous, perhaps too generous, but Eliza found herself wanting to trust him. There was something direct and honest in James Kincaid's manner, a straightforwardness that appealed to her after Bernard's deceptions. I accept your offer, she said finally. On the condition that if either of us finds the arrangement unsuitable, we can end it with 2 weeks' notice. Agreed. James extended his hand across the table and Eliza shook it. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not crushing. They finished their meal in more comfortable silence, and when they emerged back into the blazing afternoon sun, James looked down at the dog, which had followed them out and now sat at Eliza's feet. I suppose the dog comes too, if you do not mind, Eliza said. I cannot simply abandon him now. He needs a name then. Eliza looked at the scruffy animal, its belly finally full, its tail wagging tentatively. Faithful, she said. Because he stayed with me even when he had every reason to run, James nodded. Faithful it is, come on then, all of you. Let me get some supplies and we will head to the ranch. They stopped at the general store where James purchased flour, sugar, coffee, and various other necessities. He also bought Eliza a simple calico dress, a pair of practical boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, ignoring her protests about the expense. Consider it an advance on your wages, he said. You cannot work in that torn dress and you will get sunstroke without a proper hat. The ride north in James's wagon gave Eliza her first real view of Kansas prairie. It stretched endlessly in all directions, golden grass rippling in waves beneath the vast blue sky. It was so different from Philadelphia's crowded streets and neat gardens, so open and wild that it made her chest feel tight with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement. It takes some getting used to, James said, noticing her expression. The space. But you will come to love it. How can you be sure? Because people either love it or hate it immediately, and you do not look like you hate it. The Kincaid Ranch, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. The house was a simple wooden structure with a covered porch, weathered but solid. A barn stood nearby, along with several corrals where horses grazed in the late afternoon heat. Chickens scattered as the wagon approached, and a tabby cat watched them from the porch, railing with imperial disdain. "That is General Grant," James said, pointing at the cat. "He showed up last winter and decided he owned the place. He is a decent mouser, so I let him stay." Eliza smiled, already feeling the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. "You seem to collect strays, Mr. Kincaid." "James," he corrected, "and I suppose I do." He helped her down from the wagon, and Faithful immediately began exploring the yard, his tail wagging with new confidence. The inside of the house was exactly what Eliza had expected, functional but neglected. Dust coated every surface, dishes were piled in the basin, and cobwebs decorated the corners. But the furniture was solid, the iron stove was a good model, and the windows, though dirty, would let in plenty of light once cleaned. "I know it is a mess," James said, sounding almost apologetic. "I told you I was drowning." "It is nothing that cannot be fixed with work," Eliza assured him. "Show me where I will be sleeping." James led her upstairs to a small bedroom that had clearly been his mother's. It held a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a dresser with an oval mirror, and a washstand. The room smelled of dust and disuse, but it was clean of vermin, and the mattress, when Eliza tested it, was still sound. "I will let you settle in," James said from the doorway. "I need to tend the horses. There is a pump out back for water, and you can explore wherever you like. Supper is usually around 7, but I do not expect you to cook tonight. You have had a long day." But Eliza, energized by the meal and the prospect of useful work, shook her head. "Nonsense. You fed me and gave me employment. The least I can do is prepare a proper supper." "What do you have in your larder?" James looked surprised but pleased. "Some salt pork, eggs from the chickens, potatoes in the cellar, onions, whatever you can make from that." "More than enough," Eliza said confidently. Cooking was one of her skills, honed during her years teaching when she had lived in boarding houses and often prepared her own meals. After James left for the barn, Eliza changed into the new calico dress, marveling at the simple pleasure of clean fabric against her skin. She braided her hair into a practical plait, washed her face and hands in the basin, and went downstairs to tackle the kitchen. The next few hours passed in a blur of productive activity. She cleaned the dishes, scrubbed the counters, swept the floor, and then began preparing supper. Salt pork fried with onions and potatoes, eggs scrambled with wild herbs she found growing near the pump, and bread baked with the sourdough starter she discovered in the pantry. The physical labor felt good after weeks of helpless wandering, and for the first time since arriving in Kansas, Eliza felt like herself again. James came in just as she was setting the table, his face and hands freshly washed, his hair damp from the pump. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the transformed kitchen. "This looks," he began, then seemed at a loss for words. "Like a proper home," Eliza suggested. "Yes," his voice was soft. "It has been a long time since it looked like this." They sat down to eat, and Eliza found herself studying James more carefully in the lamplight. He had strong, work-worn hands and a face that was more interesting than handsome, with a straight nose, a firm jaw, and those unusual hazel eyes that seemed to change color depending on the light. When he smiled, which was not often but was genuine when it happened, creases formed at the corners of his eyes. "This is the best meal I have had in months," James said, and Eliza could tell he meant it. "It is only simple fare." "Simple fare cooked with care is better than fancy food cooked without it," he paused. "My mother used to say that. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, and stubborn." She followed my father out here when everyone told her she was crazy, that a city woman could not survive on the prairie. She proved them all wrong. James's expression was distant. They died in a fire. The barn caught during a lightning storm 2 summers ago. They went in to save the horses and the roof collapsed. I am so sorry, Eliza said quietly, and she meant it. Her own parents were difficult, overbearing, but she could not imagine losing them so tragically. They died doing what they thought was right. I try to honor that by keeping this place running. James looked around the kitchen, but I have been doing a poor job of it lately. I am glad you are here, Eliza. I think this arrangement will work well. That first evening set the pattern for the days that followed. Eliza rose at dawn to collect eggs and start breakfast while James tended the horses and cattle. They ate together, discussing the day's tasks, and then Eliza would tackle the endless work of managing a household while James worked the land. She discovered that she enjoyed the rhythm of ranch life, the purposeful labor so different from the genteel idleness expected of women in Philadelphia society. Faithful adapted to ranch life with enthusiasm, appointing himself guardian of the chickens and sleeping on a blanket on Eliza's bedroom floor each night. General Grant tolerated the dog with feline disdain but did not fight him, which James declared a miracle. That cat has terrorized every dog in a 5-mile radius, he said, watching as Faithful carefully walked around the cat's favorite sunning spot. He must respect Faithful, or Faithful is simply too polite to cause trouble, Eliza suggested. She fell into bed exhausted each night but satisfied, and gradually the ranch began to transform. The house gleamed with cleanliness. The garden she planted behind the kitchen began to sprout, and the account books, which had been a chaotic mess, were organized and balanced. Eliza discovered that James was a better businessman than he gave himself credit for. He just needed someone to help manage the details. But more surprising than the work was the companionship. James was an easy person to live with, quiet but not withdrawn, thoughtful without being brooding. He had a dry sense of humor that caught Eliza off guard and made her laugh at unexpected moments. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the prairie, talking about everything and nothing. "Do you miss Philadelphia?" James asked one evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival. Eliza considered the question carefully. "I miss some things. The libraries, the concerts, the sense of history in the buildings. But I do not miss the confinement, the endless rules about what was proper for a young lady. Here I can work and make decisions and be useful. You could do all those things back east if you wanted," James pointed out. "You are a school teacher." "Was a school teacher," Eliza corrected, "and even that had limitations. I could only teach young children, and I had to live under the supervision of the school board, who had opinions about everything from my hemlines to my friendships." She pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Here, I feel like I can breathe." James was quiet for a moment. "I understand that. I spent a year in Chicago once, learning about livestock markets and modern ranching techniques. It nearly killed me, being fenced in by all those buildings and people. I need the space, the sky." "Then we are both where we need to be," Eliza said softly. Something shifted between them in that moment. A recognition of kindred spirits that went beyond their practical arrangement. Eliza felt it like a physical warmth in her chest, and when James met her eyes, she saw an answering awareness in his gaze, but neither of them spoke of it. The grief of Bernard's betrayal was still too fresh for Eliza, and James, she sensed, carried his own careful reserve. So they continued as they had been, employer and employee, 2 people sharing a space and slowly becoming friends. Then came the day in early August when Eliza went into town for supplies. James had offered to accompany her, but she assured him she could manage the wagon herself. She was no longer the helpless woman who had crouched in an alley. She had grown stronger, more confident, tanned from the sun and capable from the work. Abilene was its usual chaotic self, full of cowboys fresh off the cattle trails with money to spend and mischief to make. Eliza kept her head down, made her purchases efficiently, and was loading the last bag of flour into the wagon when someone grabbed her arm. Well, well, if it is not my wayward bride. Eliza's blood ran cold. She turned to find Bernard Hayes standing behind her, his handsome face mottled with drink and his breath reeking of whiskey. He had always been good-looking in his letters and the single photograph he had sent, but in person, she could see the weakness in his mouth, the cruelty in his eyes. "Let go of me," she said firmly, trying to pull away. "Not until we have a talk." Bernard's grip tightened. "You owe me, Eliza. I spent good money courting you, sending those letters, arranging for you to come out here, and then you just disappear. That is not how this works." "You disappeared first," Eliza said, anger overriding her fear. "You lied about everything. You had no job, no prospects, no intention of marrying me honorably." "I was going to marry you once I got my money situation sorted out," Bernard said, pulling her closer. Several passers-by glanced their way but did not intervene. Domestic disputes were considered private matters. "And I have it sorted now. So you are going to come with me and we are going to make this official." "I would rather die," Eliza said, and drove her heel down hard on his instep. Bernard yelped and loosened his grip just enough for Eliza to wrench free. She scrambled up onto the wagon seat and grabbed the reins, but Bernard caught the horse's bridle. "You little. I believe the lady asked you to let go." James's voice was quiet, but it cut through the street noise like a knife. Eliza looked over to see him standing a few feet away, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. She had not even known he had followed her to town. Bernard's eyes flicked from James to the gun and back. "This is not your business, friend. This is between me and my woman." "She is not your woman," James said, his tone still conversational. "She works for me, and you are interfering with my property by detaining my wagon, so you have two choices. You can let go and walk away, or we can settle this another way." The street had gone quiet, people stopping to watch. Gunfights were common enough in Abilene, but there was something about James's calm demeanor that made this feel different, more serious. Bernard must have sensed it too, because after a long, tense moment, he released the bridle and stepped back. "This is not over," he said, looking at Eliza. "Yes, it is," James said. "Miss Thornton has no interest in you, and if I see you near her or my ranch again, we will have more than words." "Do you understand?" Bernard glared at him but nodded once before turning and stalking away, disappearing into the crowd. Eliza realized she was shaking, her hands clutching the reins so tightly her knuckles had turned white. James stepped up onto the wagon beside her and gently took the reins from her hands. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let me drive you home." The ride back to the ranch was silent, but James's solid presence beside her was comforting. When they arrived, he helped her down from the wagon and then, unexpectedly, pulled her into a brief, tight embrace. "I am sorry you had to face that," he said into her hair. "I should have insisted on coming with you." "You could not have known," Eliza said, but she did not pull away immediately. James smelled of leather and horses and sunlight, and his arms felt safe. "Thank you for following me." "I had a bad feeling," James admitted, releasing her but keeping his hands on her shoulders. "I am glad I listened to it." He paused, his hazel eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" "I will be," Eliza said, and she meant it. She was frightened, yes, but also angry, and anger was more useful than fear. "He does not get to ruin this for me. He does not get to take away what I have built here." Something fierce and proud flashed in James's expression. "No, he does not. This is your home now, Eliza, for as long as you want it to be." The word home settled into Eliza's heart with surprising weight. When had this ranch, this life, become home to her? But she realized it was true. The Kincaid Ranch felt more like home than Philadelphia ever had, and a large part of that was the man standing in front of her. That evening, James insisted on teaching Eliza to shoot. "Not because I think you cannot handle yourself," he said, setting up targets behind the barn. "But because everyone out here should know how to use a gun. It is just practical." The revolver was heavier than Eliza expected, but James was a patient teacher. He stood behind her, guiding her arms, correcting her stance, his voice steady and calm. After an hour, she managed to hit the target more often than not, and the knowledge that she could defend herself if necessary gave her a sense of power she had not realized she was missing. "You are a natural," James said with approval as she hit the center of the target for the first time. "A few more practice sessions and you will be better than me." "I doubt that," Eliza said, but she was pleased. She turned to hand him back the gun and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What?" "Nothing," James said, but his voice was softer than usual. I am glad you came here, Eliza. Even though the circumstances were not ideal, I am glad you stayed." "So am I," Eliza said honestly. Their eyes held for a long moment, and she felt the air between them charge with possibility. But then Faithful barked from the porch, breaking the spell, and they both turned away, the moment passing but not forgotten. The rest of August passed in a haze of heat and hard work. The garden flourished under Eliza's care, producing tomatoes, beans, squash, and herbs. She canned and preserved as much as she could, preparing for the winter James warned her about. The cattle grew fat on the prairie grass, and James broke 3 new horses to saddle, selling them to a rancher from Topeka for a good profit. They also received visits from neighbors. Widow Parker came by once a week, ostensibly to chaperone but really just to gossip and eat Eliza's cooking. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had outlived 3 husbands and claimed to have seen everything the West had to offer. "You two are doing a poor job of fooling anyone," she said one afternoon, watching as James and Eliza worked together in the garden, their movements synchronized from weeks of cooperation. "The whole county knows you are smitten with each other." "We have a professional arrangement," Eliza protested, feeling her cheeks heat. "Professional my foot," Mrs. Parker snorted. "That boy looks at you like you hung the moon, and you light up whenever he walks in the room. The only question is which one of you is going to admit it first." But admitting it felt dangerous. Eliza had been wrong about Bernard, had let hope and loneliness cloud her judgment. What if she was wrong about James too? What if this warm companionship was just proximity and gratitude rather than genuine affection? She could not bear to ruin what they had built by wanting more than he was willing to give. James, for his part, seemed equally reluctant to change the careful balance of their relationship. He was attentive but never improper, kind but never presumptuous. Sometimes Eliza caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart race, but he never acted on whatever he was feeling. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the early September storm. It came out of nowhere, one of those violent prairie thunderstorms that turned day into night and shook the earth with fury. James was out checking the fence line when the clouds rolled in, and by the time he made it back to the ranch, he was soaked through and shaking with cold. "Get out of those wet clothes," Eliza ordered, already stoking the fire and heating water. "You will catch your death." James obeyed without argument, which told her how badly the cold had affected him. When he came back downstairs wearing dry clothes and wrapped in a blanket, his teeth were still chattering. Eliza made him sit by the fire and brought him hot coffee laced with whiskey. "Drink," she commanded, and James did, his hands wrapped around the mug. Outside, the storm raged, wind howling around the house and rain hammering against the windows. Lightning flashed in jagged sheets, and thunder shook the walls. Faithful whined and pressed against Eliza's legs, and even General Grant abandoned his usual dignity to hide under the kitchen table. "This is a bad one," James said, his voice rough. "I need to check the barn, make sure the horses are secure." "You are not going anywhere," Eliza said firmly. "You can barely stand and the storm is too dangerous. The horses will have to manage on their own." She expected an argument, but James just nodded wearily and closed his eyes. Eliza watched him, concerned. His color was off, his breathing slightly labored. She put a hand to his forehead and felt heat radiating from his skin. "You have a fever," she said, trying to keep the worry from her voice. "I am fine," James mumbled, but he was clearly not fine. Eliza spent the rest of the afternoon and evening tending him, bringing cool cloths for his forehead, making sure he drank water and broth, and stoking the fire to keep him warm but not too warm. The fever climbed as the storm intensified, and by midnight James was delirious, mumbling about his parents and the fire, about cattle prices and horses that needed breaking. "Eliza," he said at one point, his eyes glassy but fixed on her face. "Eliza, do not leave." "I am right here," she assured him, taking his hand. "I am not going anywhere. No, I mean, do not leave the ranch, do not leave me." His grip tightened. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need you here, not just for the work, I need you." Eliza's heart clenched. "James, you are feverish. You do not know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying," James insisted, struggling to sit up. "I have been a coward, afraid to tell you how I feel because I thought you needed time, needed space after what that bastard did to you, but I cannot keep pretending. I love you, Eliza. I think I have loved you since I saw you feeding that stray dog, putting his needs before your own even when you had nothing. You are the bravest, kindest, most stubborn woman I have ever met, and I love you." Tears sprang to Eliza's eyes. "James, you do not have to say anything," James said, his strength failing as he slumped back against the pillows. "I just needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud at least once." He closed his eyes then, his breathing evening out as he slipped into a more restful sleep. Eliza sat beside him, holding his hand, her mind reeling. Did he mean it? Or was it just fever talking? But she remembered Mrs. Parker's words, remembered all the small moments over the past months when she had caught James looking at her with that particular expression. She remembered the way he had defended her against Bernard, the way he had taught her to shoot with such patience, the way he smiled when he came in from the fields and smelled her cooking. And she recognized, with startling clarity, that she loved him too. Somewhere between that first meal and tonight's vigil, James Kincaid had become the center of her world. She loved his quiet strength, his dry humor, his dedication to honoring his parents' legacy. She loved the way he treated Faithful with respect, the way he never made her feel lesser for being a woman, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words truly mattered. The storm passed during the night, and by morning, James's fever had broken. Eliza, who had dozed in the chair beside him, woke to find him watching her with clear eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Good morning," Eliza replied. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a herd of cattle." James paused. "Eliza, about last night, did you mean it?" she interrupted. "What you said about loving me," James's expression became guarded. "I was feverish. I may have said things that were inappropriate, and I apologize if I made you uncomfortable." "James Kincaid, answer the question," Eliza said sharply. "Did you mean it?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him make a decision. "Yes," he said simply. "I meant every word, I love you. If that means you want to leave, I will understand, but I will not take it back because it is the truth." Eliza felt a smile spread across her face, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. "You are an idiot," she said fondly, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. James froze for a heartbeat, and then his arms came around her, pulling her closer as he returned the kiss with an intensity that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James was staring at her with wonder. "Does this mean?" "It means I love you too," Eliza said, laughing at his expression. "I have been too afraid to admit it, too scared of being wrong again, but I am not wrong about you, James. I know I am not." "You are definitely not wrong," James assured her, cupping her face in his hands. "God, Eliza, I have wanted to do that for months." "Then why did you not?" "Because I wanted you to have time to heal. I did not want you to think I expected anything beyond our arrangement." James brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was trying to be honorable." "You are the most honorable man I have ever met," Eliza said softly. "But I do not need more time. I know my own heart, and it is yours if you want it." "If I want it," James laughed, a sound of pure happiness. "Eliza Thornton, I want everything you are willing to give me." They kissed again, slower this time, tender and full of promise. Outside, the morning sun broke through the dissipating clouds, and somewhere nearby, Faithful barked joyfully, as if celebrating with them. The next few weeks passed in a golden haze. James recovered quickly from his illness, and their relationship transformed from careful friendship into open courtship. He courted her properly, despite the fact that they lived under the same roof, bringing her wildflowers from the prairie and carving her a set of beautiful hair combs from cherrywood. Eliza baked his favorite foods and sat with him on the porch in the evenings, their hands intertwined as they watched the stars emerge. Mrs. Parker declared herself vindicated and insisted on planning a wedding. "You cannot just keep living in sin," she said sternly, though her eyes twinkled. "Even if everyone knows you have been perfect angels, you need to make it official." James proposed formally in early October, going down on one knee in the garden Eliza had planted, with Faithful and General Grant as witnesses. The ring had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small sapphire, and Eliza cried when he slid it onto her finger. "Yes," she said before he could even ask the question. "Yes, James, I will marry you." They were wed in late October, in the small church in Abilene with half the county in attendance. Eliza wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Parker had saved from her own wedding days, altered to fit. James wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face as they exchanged vows. "I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you for all the days of my life," James said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You are my partner, my equal, my heart. I am a better man because you chose me." Eliza's voice shook as she spoke her own vows. "I promise to love you through good times and hardship, to build a life with you on this land we both cherish, to be your companion in all things. You saved me, James, not just from hunger but from hopelessness. You showed me what true love looks like." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance sighed audibly. The reception afterward was a raucous affair, with dancing and food and toasts that grew progressively more embarrassing as the evening wore on. But the best part was going home together, truly together now, to the ranch that had become their shared sanctuary. James carried Eliza over the threshold, and Faithful pranced around them, barking excitedly, while General Grant watched with feline approval from his perch on the windowsill. Their wedding night was sweet and gentle, full of whispered endearments and tender exploration. James was patient and attentive, making sure Eliza felt cherished and safe. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in his, now their bed, and James traced idle patterns on her shoulder. "I never thought I would have this," he admitted quietly. "After my parents died, I thought I was destined to work this ranch alone, to let the house fall into disrepair because I could not manage everything. And then you appeared, feeding a stray dog, looking fierce despite having nothing. You changed everything." "We changed everything together," Eliza corrected. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You saw past my circumstances to who I could be." "Who you always were," James said. "I just gave you the space to show it." The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of work and joy. Eliza continued to manage the household and the books, while James expanded the ranch's operations. They bought 20 more head of cattle and began breeding horses more seriously. Eliza's business sense complemented James's practical knowledge, and together they made the Kincaid Ranch more profitable than it had been in years. But it was not just about the work. It was about the life they built together, the thousand small intimacies of shared days. It was James bringing her coffee in the morning before she was fully awake, and Eliza mending his shirts in the evenings while he read the newspaper aloud. It was arguing good-naturedly about whether to paint the barn red or white, and making love in the middle of the afternoon when the work was done early. It was Faithful growing old and gray, but still following Eliza everywhere, and General Grant deigning to sit on James's lap during cold winter evenings. In the spring of 1880, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but waited until she was certain before telling James. When she finally did, over breakfast on a sunny April morning, his face transformed with such joy that she started crying. "A baby," he said wonderingly, coming around the table to pull her into his arms. "Eliza, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" She asked, even though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," James said, kissing her soundly. "I am terrified and ecstatic and so grateful I could burst." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Eliza found the summer heat oppressive as her belly grew. James hovered nervously, insisting she rest more and work less, until Eliza finally had to order him to stop treating her like spun glass. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she said exasperatedly. "I am perfectly capable of collecting eggs and weeding the garden." "I know, James ran a hand through his hair. "I could not bear it if something happened to you." Eliza softened, taking his hand and placing it on her swollen belly. "I am fine, we are both fine, feel the baby is kicking." James's face filled with wonder as he felt the small thumps against his palm. "That is our child," he said softly, "our son or daughter." "I think it is a boy," Eliza said. "He kicks like a mule." She was right. In December of 1880, after a long but uncomplicated labor attended by Mrs. Parker and the doctor from town, Eliza gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's hazel eyes and his mother's determined chin. They named him Thomas, after James's father, and James wept openly when he held his son for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered to Eliza, who was exhausted but radiant. "Thank you for this gift, for everything." "He is ours," Eliza said, watching as James cradled the tiny bundle with infinite care. "Our family." Faithful, now gray-muzzled and slower but still devoted, took up guard duty outside the nursery, and General Grant, in a surprising show of affection, often slept in the cradle when Thomas was not in it, keeping it warm. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and animals with the same passion as his parents. In 1883, Eliza gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after James's mother, a sweet-tempered child with her mother's blue eyes and her father's steady disposition. And in 1886, another son arrived, whom they named Samuel, a rambunctious baby who seemed determined to keep them all on their toes. The ranch prospered as well. James became known throughout Kansas for breeding quality horses, and Eliza's management ensured that every dollar was wisely invested and accounted for. They expanded the house, adding rooms for the children and a proper office for Eliza's bookkeeping. They hired help as needed but remained hands-on, teaching their children the value of hard work and the beauty of the land they called home. Faithful passed away peacefully in the summer of 1888. Old and content, with his head in Eliza's lap and surrounded by the family he had adopted. They buried him under an oak tree near the house, and Thomas carved a marker that read, "Faithful, a true friend." James held Eliza as she cried, understanding that she was not just mourning a dog but remembering the desperate woman she had been when Faithful first came into her life. "You are not that person anymore," James said gently, "but you honor who you were by remembering." "I honor who I was by loving who I have become," Eliza corrected, "and I could not have become this person without you." As the years turned into decades, James and Eliza Kincaid became pillars of their community. They helped neighbors through hard times, opened their home to travelers who needed shelter, and raised their children to be kind, hardworking, and fair-minded. The ranch that had once been James's lonely burden became a thriving family enterprise, with Thomas eventually taking over the day-to-day operations while James and Eliza moved into advisory roles. In the summer of 1898, on their 20th wedding anniversary, James and Eliza sat on the porch they had sat on so many times before, now weathered and familiar, watching their grandchildren. Thomas had married a teacher from Salina, and they had 2 young children, play in the yard where Eliza's garden still flourished. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked, taking her hand. Their hands were older now, marked with work and time, but the touch still sent warmth through Eliza's chest. "Coming west, staying here instead of returning to Philadelphia." Eliza looked at him, at the silver threading through his dark hair, at the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun and from laughter. She looked at the ranch spread before them, at the home they had built together, at the family that carried their legacy forward. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "You gave me everything, James, a home, a purpose, a family, a love I never dreamed possible. How could I regret that?" "I think I am the one who was given everything," James said, lifting her hand to kiss it. "You walked into my life when you had nothing, and you gave me the world." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The land stretched endlessly before them, the same land that had witnessed their first meeting, their courtship, their wedding, the birth of their children, and all the 1,000 moments in between that made a life worth living. Eliza thought about the woman she had been, crouching in an alley and feeding her last crust of bread to a stray dog, certain that she had nothing left to offer the world. And she marveled at how wrong she had been. She had everything to offer, her strength, her intelligence, her capacity for love, and she had found someone who recognized that, who saw her worth when she could barely see it herself. "I love you," she said to James, the words as easy and natural as breathing after 20 years of saying them. "I love you too," James replied, pulling her close. "Always have, always will." And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Eliza Kincaid, once Eliza Thornton, once a desperate woman with no prospects, felt nothing but gratitude for the day a cowboy had found her in an alley and said words that changed everything. "Come inside, I'll feed you both proper." Those simple words had led to this rich, full, beautiful life, and she would not change a single moment of it. Their story became one of those tales passed down through generations, told and retold by their descendants. The story of how a Philadelphia schoolteacher and a Kansas cowboy found each other in the most unlikely way, and built something lasting from scraps and determination and love. It was a story of the American West, of hardship and hope, of two people who chose each other and made that choice every day for the rest of their lives. And at the heart of it was a simple truth. Sometimes salvation comes not with fanfare but with a quiet invitation, not through grand gestures but through small acts of kindness that ripple outward into forever.